In 1967, when Harlem was a crucible of racial tension, civil rights struggles, and underground power games, a group of white supremacists made a decision that would seal their fate. They thought their violence could break the unity of Harlem. They thought they could destroy one of Bumpy Johnson's closest friends, a well-respected community leader, and escape the wrath of Harlem's kingpin. They had no idea what they were about to unleash. Their vicious attack on Bumpy's friend, a man who had fought for justice in Harlem for years, was meant to send a message. But instead, it sparked a fire that would burn them to the ground. In 72 hours, the supremacists who had murdered Bumpy's friend were found, dismembered, and burned alive in their own home. The city would never forget the price of crossing Bumpy Johnson, a man who protected his own with deadly precision. The white supremacist group led by Derek "Red" Collins, a brutal and arrogant man, had controlled the outskirts of Harlem for years. With their violent, hate-fueled agenda, they targeted black activists and anyone they perceived as a threat to their vision of supremacy. Collins, at 6'2", with fiery red hair and a scarred face, had earned his reputation through intimidation and ruthless violence. His men were a mix of disillusioned former soldiers, failed criminals, and those who harbored deep-seated hate. They thrived on fear, leaving a trail of bloodshed wherever they went. Collins and his gang held sway over the outer boroughs, but they had always been careful to avoid crossing into Harlem, knowing it was Bumpy Johnson's turf. However, in their eyes, Harlem was nothing more than a symbol of defiance to their ideals, a place where their kind of power had no place. But when they crossed the line and murdered Bumpy's close friend, a revered activist named Elijah Eli Harris, they stepped into a world they could never understand. Eli was more than just a friend to Bumpy. He was a brother, a man who had fought for civil rights and justice for Harlem's people. His death was personal. It wasn't just a loss for the community. It was an affront to everything Bumpy stood for. The supremacists thought their act of violence would intimidate Bumpy and his people. They were wrong. They had just awakened the most fearsome protector Harlem had ever known. Bumpy Johnson's reputation was built on more than just his business dealings. It was his unwavering protection of those he considered family. Harlem, for all its struggles, was his home. The streets ran with loyalty and respect, and anyone who threatened that balance faced a swift and brutal reckoning. The murder of Eli Harris wasn't just an attack on one man. It was an attack on the community Bumpy had spent his life building and protecting. The supremacists had underestimated not just Bumpy's power, but the power of unity within Harlem's streets. The stakes were high. The supremacists had killed a man who had worked tirelessly for the advancement of his people, and now they had to answer for it. The challenge was not just personal for Bumpy, it was a challenge to the very ideals that kept Harlem's people strong. To let the supremacists get away with murder would mean the collapse of everything Bumpy had worked to protect. In the world of street justice, betrayal was met with vengeance. The supremacists had chosen to attack a man Bumpy considered family, and in doing so, they had sealed their fate. Bumpy's response would be swift, precise, and devastating. No one was beyond the reach of Harlem's king. The tension was building, and the streets of Harlem could feel it. Bumpy Johnson wasn't a man to act rashly, but when the lives of his loved ones were at stake, there would be no mercy. It started when Bumpy received the news about Eli's murder. The informants in his network, men who moved through Harlem's streets, always watching, had seen the supremacist gang in action. The brutality of the attack on Eli was more than just a random act of violence. It was a declaration of war. Eli had been speaking at a civil rights rally when Collins and his gang ambushed him. The mob dragged him into an alley, beat him senseless, and shot him in cold blood. They thought they had silenced him forever, but they hadn't. They had just made the mistake of provoking a storm they couldn't survive. As Bumpy sat alone in his office, the weight of the loss pressed heavily on him. His friend, a man who had been dedicated to the cause of justice, had been taken. The streets of Harlem were no longer safe. The supremacists had crossed the line, but Bumpy was calm. He wasn't a man who let emotion cloud his judgment. He knew what had to be done. The clock was ticking. In 72 hours, the supremacists would pay the price for their mistake. Bumpy's response was not going to be rash or impulsive. It was going to be deliberate. He called his most trusted allies and gave them a simple directive. Find them, and when you do, make sure they know what it means to cross me. Bumpy learned everything he needed to know about the supremacists' movements, where they stayed, who they spoke to, and when they were vulnerable. The streets of Harlem were his eyes and ears. His informants were everywhere, feeding him information in real time. Every step the supremacists took was accounted for. Bumpy wasn't going to let them get away with it. His reaction was calm, measured. He didn't need to rant or rave. He didn't need to make a public spectacle. Bumpy knew that the best kind of justice was one that didn't need to be explained. His men knew their roles: swift retaliation, precise execution. There would be no warning for the supremacists, just the cold, unflinching punishment of a man who had been wronged. "I'm going to tell you something once," Bumpy said to his closest confidants. "No one touches what's mine. And when you attack my family, you're signing your own death warrant. We don't forgive. We don't forget." As the days went on, the supremacists continued their routines, oblivious to the danger closing in on them. They thought they had gotten away with murder, but Bumpy's men were already in position, watching every move, making sure the time was right. Bumpy had never been one to rush into violence, but this wasn't just about retaliation. This was about justice for Eli, and for every man, woman, and child in Harlem who believed that respect and loyalty meant something. The supremacists, in their arrogance, believed they had won. They continued their hateful speeches, gathered in their secretive meetings, and went about their business as if nothing had changed. The Klan was still a threat, but they didn't realize that their days were numbered. Bumpy's strategy was flawless. He let them believe they were safe, let them think that their lives would continue as usual. The 72-hour window was drawing to a close, and Bumpy's patience was about to pay off. His men tightened the noose, prepared the final blow. As the supremacists went about their lives, Bumpy made sure that when the time came, there would be no escape. The trap was set. It was the 7th day after the murder of Eli Harris, and Tony "Red" Collins, the leader of the supremacist gang, sat in his home, feeling the false security of his position. He had been operating under the delusion that his power in Harlem, combined with his connections to the Klan, made him untouchable. He went about his evening as usual, drinking with his men, planning their next move, and counting the money he had earned from his latest crime sprees. But as the evening wore on, the atmosphere in Collins' house began to change. There was a sudden shift in the air, an oppressive silence. The usual buzz of activity from his crew died down, replaced by an uneasy stillness. The door to the back room creaked open. Collins, half drunk, looked up from his glass of bourbon, confused. But as he saw the figure stepping into the room, his confusion turned to dread. Bumpy Johnson, with his signature calm stride, Bumpy entered the room. His presence alone was enough to fill the space with an almost tangible weight. The room froze. No one moved. No one spoke. Collins, trying to hold on to his arrogance, stood up quickly. "You think you can just walk in here?" he sneered, reaching for his gun at his side. "Do you know who I am?" Bumpy didn't flinch. He didn't even look at Collins as the gun slowly came out of its holster. His focus was fixed, laser sharp, on the man who had taken the life of his friend, his brother. Eli had been an activist, a fighter for justice, and for that, he had paid the ultimate price. Now, it was time for Collins to pay his. "I know exactly who you are," Bumpy said quietly, his voice a cold echo in the room. "And you've made a grave mistake." The gun in Collins' hand was raised, but before he could make a move, Bumpy's men closed in, surrounding him. His crew was no help. They were too stunned by the sheer power Bumpy exuded to lift a finger. The quiet power of the King of Harlem filled the room like a storm waiting to break. "Not so tough now, are you, Red?" Bumpy continued, his voice like ice. "You thought you could come into my neighborhood, kill my friend, and walk away free? You thought you could get away with this?" Collins opened his mouth to speak, but his words died in his throat as Bumpy took another step forward. He looked around at his men, who were standing still, their eyes full of fear. They knew what was coming, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. In a split second, Bumpy's men sprang into action. There was no struggle, no dramatic fight. It was quick, clean, and precise. Collins didn't stand a chance. In less than 30 seconds, his fate had been sealed. The very man who thought he was untouchable, who thought he could murder a friend of Bumpy's and live to boast about it, was on his knees, begging. Bumpy looked down at him, emotionless. "You should have known better than to mess with me," he said, coldly, "and now you're going to pay for it." In the hours that followed, the city of Harlem would witness an image that would become ingrained in its history. Tony Collins, the once feared leader of the supremacist gang, found dead in his home. But his death wasn't quick or merciful. His body was burned, dismembered, and left as a grotesque reminder of the consequences of crossing Bumpy Johnson. The supremacists had believed they were untouchable, hidden behind their white robes and hate-filled rhetoric. They thought their violence and intimidation would never come back to haunt them. But Bumpy's message was simple and undeniable. No one, no matter how powerful, could take from him what mattered most. For Bumpy, this wasn't about vengeance. It was about justice. Eli's life was taken because of hatred, because of greed, and because a man thought he could do whatever he wanted without consequence. Bumpy wasn't going to let that go unanswered. He would make sure that the supremacists knew that they had no place in Harlem. No one could cross that line without facing the price of it. Justice had been delivered, and the streets of Harlem once again felt the power of respect. Bumpy's retaliation wasn't about showing power. It was about sending a message. He had protected his family, his people, and his home. Those who thought they could threaten the peace of Harlem had learned a hard lesson. The aftermath of Collins' death echoed through the streets of Harlem. The supremacists, once emboldened by their hatred, were now silenced. No one dared show their faces in Harlem for fear of the wrath of Bumpy Johnson. His message had been clear, and the community understood it. There was no room for hate, no tolerance for violence, and no escape for those who sought to harm what was his. The impact on the community was profound. The loss of Eli Harris had been a blow to Harlem, But his death sparked something else, a unified resistance against hate and oppression. Bumpy's response to the murder wasn't just about protecting his family. It was about sending a message to anyone who thought they could disrupt the fragile peace Harlem had fought so hard to maintain. Bumpy's actions didn't just solidify his position as Harlem's protector. They made him a legend. His reputation was untouchable, his power absolute. The story of how he avenged his friend and brought down a group of violent white supremacists became a symbol of justice, a story that would be passed down through generations. If this story hit you, smash that subscribe button. We're telling the Bumpy Johnson stories that history forgot, the moments that made him a legend, the code that made him untouchable. Drop a like if you think Bumpy was the smartest man in Harlem. And in the comments, tell me, what would you have done if you were in Bumpy's shoes? Would you have acted the same way? Or would you have chosen a different path to justice? More legendary stories coming next. Don't miss it.